The sun had barely pierced the dense morning haze over Truk Lagoon when Admiral Mineichi Koga stood at the map table in the Imperial Japanese Navy's forward command post. The lagoon, a vast crescent of cobalt and emerald waters dotted with small islands, had long been considered Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, an impregnable stronghold where carriers, cruisers and supply ships could anchor safely behind natural reefs. Yet, for the first time since the outbreak of war in the Pacific, Koga felt a cold uncertainty grip him, not from the thunder of guns or the whine of torpedoes, but from something more insidious, the relentless shadow of U.S. industrial power. Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara, sitting across from him, leafed through the latest reconnaissance reports, his brow furrowed. "They are here again," Hara muttered, voice low but taut with unease. "Sighted near the Marianas 2 weeks ago. Reports indicate the formation, 3 carriers, nearly 100 aircraft, departed from Pearl Harbor, passed undetected, and struck our airfields on Wotje before disappearing without warning." Koga's hand hovered over the annotated map. 3 carriers, he repeated, almost as if saying it aloud would make it less real. "And they are not alone. Our scouts report a second group heading from Espiritu Santo, possibly to reinforce them." The reports were precise. The U.S. Essex-class carriers had become a recurring nightmare. Each vessel displaced roughly 27,100 tons and could carry between 90 and 100 aircraft, a mix of F6F Hellcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avengers. From each carrier deck, air groups could generate up to 250 sorties a day, and the combination of speed, maneuverability, and pilot rotation created an operational tempo that the Japanese Navy had not encountered before. "What strikes me," Hara continued, tapping the top of a reconnaissance sheet, "is their rhythm. Every 6 weeks, a new task force appears in our sector. Our calculations predicted longer intervals between such strikes. We cannot match this tempo. Even if we dispatch aircraft to intercept, they vanish before our radar can guide us." Koga nodded, eyes fixed on the inked circles marking anchorages along the Caroline Islands. The Imperial Japanese Navy had anticipated carrier raids, yes, but in the traditional sense, limited by shipbuilding capacity, pilot training, and aircraft availability. Now every expectation had been rendered obsolete by a simple, relentless fact. The United States could build carriers faster than Japan could sink them. Essex-class hulls were emerging from American shipyards with industrial precision: North Island in San Diego, Fall River in Quincy, and the Philadelphia Navy Yard, each pushing assembly lines that operated almost ceaselessly. Hara's voice broke the silence. "And they are not flying alone. Lightning aircraft, long-range P-38s, have been observed escorting bombers across open water. They maintain altitude superiority, and they can strike beyond the reach of our Zeros. Our pilots report losses before they even reach the targets." Koga exhaled slowly, the weight of accumulated intelligence pressing against him. He remembered the reports from intercepted communications and post-strike analyses. A strike from an Essex carrier could launch aircraft at dawn, hit the target before mid-morning, and return to deck with minimal losses. The U.S. Navy had perfected coordination between carrier decks and land-based reconnaissance planes. Japanese radar stations, hampered by terrain and technological limitations, often picked up the formation too late to mount an effective defense. The Admiral's eyes swept across his staff. Young officers scurried to pin new intelligence markers onto the map, each a fragment of a story they could not yet complete. "Every 6 weeks," he muttered, almost to himself. "They arrive, strike, and depart. Our pilots, our planes, our fortifications, they cannot respond in time. It is as if they are everywhere at once." Reports from captured Japanese war diaries corroborated the fear. Reconnaissance flights from Truk's outer islands described steel leviathans on the horizon, decks bristling with fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Yet when Japanese interceptors were scrambled, the US task force had already disappeared beyond the limit of visual range. The Essex carrier's speed, nearly 33 knots at flank, combined with precise navigation, allowed them to strike and vanish like ghosts. The room fell into a tense silence as Hara laid out the operational implications. "Koga-san, we cannot anticipate their movements using traditional scouting. Our radar cannot penetrate far enough. Our observers on Woliai and Ponape report sightings too late. By the time we mount a counterstrike, the task force has already left the operational area." A junior officer, barely 23, dared to speak. "Admiral, should we consider dispersal? Moving our air units further inland, conserving aircraft for defence rather than forward sorties?" Hara shook his head sharply. "No, that only concedes initiative. The Americans rely on speed and concentration. If we scatter, we lose coordination entirely. And yet if we concentrate, they strike with overwhelming force. This is impossible." Koga's gaze drifted to the lagoon itself, where calm waters betrayed no hint of the strategic nightmare looming above. He thought of the previous 6 months. Each time the US carriers appeared, the cycle repeated. Aircraft launched from decks, escorted by long-range P-38 Lightnings, would sweep Japanese airfields, destroy aircraft on the ground, and vanish before any meaningful engagement could occur. Each raid left Japanese pilots exhausted, morale strained, and defensive infrastructure weakened. "This is not mere attrition," Koga said finally. "It is a war of endurance. They have resources we cannot match, and they leverage them with precision. We measure losses in planes, pilots, and hours of flight. They measure us in compliance with their schedule. Every 6 weeks, like clockwork, another hammer falls." Hara glanced at the map again, circling potential landing points for US amphibious operations. "And we know little of their intentions beyond these raids. They could strike Palau, Yap, or the Marianas next. The Essex-class carriers allow them to project power anywhere, unopposed for weeks at a time." Outside the command post, the sun climbed higher, scattering golden light across the lagoon. The natural beauty of Truk's waters belied the tension within the stone and concrete of the command centre. Koga's fingers traced the paths of enemy task forces on the map one final time. In each report, in every intercepted communication, the lesson was clear. Japan's intelligence network, sophisticated though it was, could not detect these formations in time. Not because of incompetence, but because the enemy's industrial and operational pace had outstripped the bounds of traditional naval warfare. The Admiral's voice, low and measured, carried over the table. "We are witnessing a new type of war, one in which steel and speed outweigh cunning and tradition. And for the first time, we are not merely defending territory. We are reacting to a force we cannot see until it is upon us." Hara nodded grimly. "The Essex carriers. Every 6 weeks they appear, and every 6 weeks our options shrink." As the staff continued their analysis, Koga leaned back, eyes narrowing on the far horizon. The shadow of the Essex-class carriers had fallen over Truk Lagoon, and there was no telling when or where they would strike next. October 1943 was a month that would be remembered in the records of both the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy. From the deck of the USS Essex, Captain John Jack Henderson scanned the horizon with a practiced eye. The sun had barely risen, painting the Pacific in muted shades of orange and silver, when the first flight of F6F Hellcats roared off the carrier's deck. Their task was reconnaissance first, strike missions second, and escort duties entwined throughout. This was the rhythm of American carrier operations. Every sortie precisely timed, every aircraft accounted for, every pilot briefed to anticipate the enemy before he appeared. The Essex-class carriers were a marvel of industrial efficiency. Displacing approximately 27,100 tons and capable of speeds up to 33 knots, each ship could sustain a continuous rotation of 250 to 300 sorties per day. Air groups were meticulously organized: 24 Hellcats for air superiority, 36 SBD Dauntless dive bombers for precision strikes, and 30 TBF Avenger torpedo planes to target ships. Pilots, mechanics, and support crews had been trained for months, ensuring that no aircraft was idle and no operation uncoordinated. Lieutenant Samuel "Sam" Douglas, flying a P-38 Lightning, glanced at his wingman as they ascended above the clouds. Their task was clear: long-range escort. The twin-engine fighters, capable of travelling over 1,100 miles with drop tanks, extended the strike capability of the carrier group far beyond what Japanese planners anticipated. Intelligence from previous operations indicated that the P-38's presence had already disrupted several Japanese air patrols, preventing effective interceptions of US dive bombers. "Remember," Henderson's voice crackled over the radio, "we're not just hitting ships or airfields today. We're shaping their perception. Make every sortie count. Keep them guessing." The Essex's air operations had a cadence that Japanese intelligence could not easily decipher. Every 6 weeks, a carrier group appeared in the Central Pacific, often in locations previously considered secure. This predictability was deceptive. While the rhythm was known, the exact coordinates, timing, and composition of each strike group remained fluid. Truk Lagoon, once seen as untouchable, had become a proving ground for this new operational doctrine. From the Japanese side, intelligence reports had confirmed the carrier's approach weeks in advance, yet the actual engagement remained a surprise. Patrols launched from Truk and surrounding islands often sighted only fragments of the US strike force, making coordinated defensive efforts nearly impossible. Admiral Koga's staff recorded sightings of approaching aircraft, only to find that US squadrons had already struck targets inland or at sea before Japanese fighters could engage. Douglas and his P-38 wingman broke through a layer of cumulus clouds, the vast Pacific stretching endlessly below them. Spotting Truk in the distance, the Japanese positions became visible: moored vessels, airfields lined with Zeros, and infrastructure partially rebuilt after prior raids. Each sortie was a delicate balance of aggression and calculation. The P-38s provided early warning to dive bombers, scouting ahead, reporting flak concentrations, and neutralizing any defensive fighters that attempted to intercept the American strike. In the Essex's combat reports, sorties were logged with exacting precision. Lieutenant Commander Harold Finch noted the numbers for the day: 285 sorties launched, 273 successfully completed, 7 aircraft damaged but returning to carrier decks, and 0 losses in the strike group. Each sortie represented not only immediate tactical impact, but also a psychological advantage. Japanese pilots, knowing that US forces could appear in overwhelming numbers with precise coordination, grew wary, sometimes hesitant to commit to engagements that historically might have been routine. The operational success of these carrier raids was inseparable from the US industrial framework. While Truk's Japanese defenders struggled to replace aircraft lost in combat, the Essex-class carriers continuously rotated air groups. Pilots who had flown intensive combat missions were rotated back to rear bases for rest and retraining. Aircraft damaged in action were replaced swiftly, often arriving within days. This ensured that every 6-week cycle maintained peak strike capability, regardless of attrition. Douglas's Lightning detected anti-aircraft fire erupting below. "Tally-ho," he muttered, signalling his wingman. Dive bombers from the Essex banked sharply, releasing ordnance on supply depots, fuel storage, and the occasional anchored ship. Torpedo planes circled, selecting high-value targets with methodical precision. In every action, the presence of the P-38s made the difference. Enemy interceptors were engaged early, reducing the risk to slower bombers and maximizing damage to strategic objectives. On the Japanese side, Vice Admiral Hara noted in his log, "The American carrier's air group composition allows for flexibility and endurance." P-38 escorts extend strike ranges beyond prior estimates. Our Zeros cannot intercept effectively without sustaining unacceptable losses. The psychological effect on our personnel is profound. Every raid reinforces the inevitability of US operational dominance. Back aboard the Essex, Captain Henderson monitored communications. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft indicated that Japanese forces were attempting to reposition, but the strike schedule was already executed. "We've hit the critical points," he noted. "No surprise, no casualties among our crews. Next rotation in 6 weeks will be just as effective. They may anticipate our presence, but they cannot stop it." This cycle, the 6-week rhythm, was becoming the defining feature of Pacific operations. US commanders understood that the interval allowed for rotation, replenishment, and intelligence preparation. Japanese officers, meanwhile, measured each interval in anxiety, preparing for strikes that could arrive at any moment and vanish just as quickly. The Essex-class carriers, with their precise planning, overwhelming sortie capabilities, and long-range fighter escorts, had shifted the strategic balance. As the day's operations concluded, Douglas and his wingman returned to the carrier deck. The sun had reached its zenith, reflecting off the steel hulls of ships below and the endless water beyond. Each aircraft that landed safely, every pilot accounted for, reinforced the US Navy's growing operational dominance. For the Japanese commanders observing from Truk, the realization was stark. Every 6 weeks the cycle repeated, and each cycle brought a mounting sense of inevitability. The shadow of the Essex-class carriers extended beyond mere physical destruction. It was a statement of industrial, operational, and psychological supremacy. And in the weeks ahead, that shadow would only lengthen. By November 1943, the Japanese Imperial Navy had begun to understand the scale of the operational challenge presented by US carrier dominance. Intelligence from Truk Lagoon indicated that Essex-class carriers had become almost omnipresent in the Central Pacific, appearing roughly every 6 weeks with devastating precision. Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara convened a meeting of senior staff officers in the cramped briefing room of the Truk headquarters. The walls, lined with maps detailing the Caroline Islands and surrounding sea lanes, reflected the flickering light of oil lamps as officers pored over the latest reconnaissance data. Admiral Mineichi Koga, seated at the head of the table, spoke first. His voice carried the weight of decades of service, but behind the measured tone lay a subtle tension. "Our patrols confirm the arrival of US carriers with regularity," he said. "We can predict the cycle, yes, but we cannot predict the position. Our radar coverage is inadequate, our scouting insufficient. Each sighting occurs too late to mount a coordinated defense. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft, primarily float planes launched from light cruisers and destroyers, were fragmented and often outdated. The limitations of the Japanese radar system, short range, low frequency, and poor resolution over open ocean, meant that carrier groups could appear hundreds of miles from their expected positions. Hara and his staff were forced to rely on human observers stationed on isolated islands, but these scouts were limited by visibility, weather, and the risk of being intercepted. Lieutenant Commander Tetsuo Sato, newly assigned to Truk, presented the latest intelligence brief. Carrier sightings indicate displacement of approximately 27,100 tons, with air groups numbering between 90 and 100 aircraft, he reported. Our estimates suggest sortie generation rates of 250 to 300 per day. The P-38 escort fighters extend operational reach beyond our interception capabilities. A murmur passed through the room. The numbers were not surprising. The Japanese Navy had tracked US shipbuilding programs for months. What was alarming was the operational integration of these resources. Aircraft rotated between carriers seamlessly, maintenance crews were prepositioned at rear bases, and pilots had standardized training that emphasized adaptability. Each strike, no matter how large or small, was executed with military precision. Koga leaned forward, eyes narrowing at the map. "Every 6 weeks," he muttered. "They arrive like a tide we cannot hold back. Even when we know they are coming, they are already gone before we can engage." The psychological toll on Japanese commanders and pilots was profound. Zeros, once dominant in Pacific airspace, were now facing P-38 Lightnings capable of long-range interception and superior performance at altitude. The P-38's twin engines allowed it to continue patrols even if one was damaged, and its speed and firepower outmatched most Japanese fighters during escort missions. For the Japanese, these twin-engine fighters became the most visible symbol of the operational gap. From the air, the situation was just as stark. A flight of Zeros, scrambled from Truk's main airfield, attempted to intercept an incoming U.S. strike group. Observers noted the Essex's air group overhead, organized in tight formations, with P-38s patrolling the flanks. The Japanese pilots engaged in sporadic dogfights, often forced to break off due to fuel limitations, loss of altitude, or overwhelming opposition. Several accounts recorded by Japanese officers after the war highlighted the futility of these engagements. "We were caught between fear and duty, unable to strike effectively, yet compelled to engage," one post-war interrogation report noted. The Essex-class carrier's strike strategy was simple yet devastatingly effective. Reconnaissance aircraft scouted ahead, identifying targets, while fighters cleared the skies of any potential threats. Dive bombers and torpedo planes executed synchronized attacks, often hitting key supply depots, fuel storage tanks, and anchored vessels. The presence of P-38s meant that even when Japanese aircraft attempted interception, losses were disproportionately high, further reducing the IJNs to mount effective resistance. Admiral Koga and Vice Admiral Hara, aware of the psychological effects, began discussing defensive adjustments. Proposals included repositioning capital ships further from Truk, dispersing aircraft across smaller airfields to avoid concentrated losses, and implementing more aggressive reconnaissance patrols. Yet each suggestion was limited by logistical constraints. Fuel shortages, maintenance bottlenecks, and the slow replacement rate of aircraft hindered effective responses. Sato concluded the briefing with an assessment of tactical limitations. Even with early warning, engagement is often delayed until the US forces have achieved their objectives. Our aircraft, even in full strength, cannot prevent destruction of infrastructure and shipping. The Essex-class carrier's combination of sortie generation, long-range fighters, and industrial endurance ensures repeated operational superiority. Outside the command centre, the waters of Truk Lagoon glimmered under the late afternoon sun. Sailors and airmen alike felt the strain of repeated attacks. Every 6 weeks, the cycle reset. American carriers would vanish from the horizon as swiftly as they had appeared, leaving behind a trail of destruction and a Japanese command increasingly reliant on hope and improvisation. For the U.S. Navy, the psychological component was just as critical. The constant presence of Essex-class carriers created an aura of inevitability. Japanese forces could anticipate the cycle, but could not interrupt it. Pilots on the Essex, trained to maximize efficiency, understood the rhythm and used it to their advantage, further eroding the defensive capabilities of Truk and surrounding islands. By nightfall, Hara reviewed intercepted radio communications, noting the frustration of his pilots and the repeated inability to engage effectively. "We must adapt," he wrote in his log. "Yet every adaptation is met with a counter we cannot predict or counter ourselves. Our eyes in the sky are blind, while theirs see across hundreds of miles." The chapter closed with a sense of mounting inevitability. The 6-week cycle of U.S. carrier strikes was not merely a tactical pattern, but a strategic statement. Essex-class carriers had transformed the Central Pacific theatre, reshaping the balance of power and exposing the vulnerabilities of even Japan's most heavily defended strongholds. The shadow they cast over Truk was not just steel and ordnance, it was operational dominance writ large, And for the Japanese Navy, every appearance reinforced the harsh reality that the tide of war was increasingly beyond their control. December 1943 brought another cycle of U.S. carrier appearances in the Central Pacific. From the vantage point of Truk Lagoon, Japanese reconnaissance could only provide fragmented glimpses of the Essex-class task forces as they moved with clinical precision across hundreds of miles of open ocean. The Imperial Japanese Navy, acutely aware of the 6-week rhythm, attempted to position its forces along anticipated flanks, yet every deployment revealed the limits of both intelligence and mobility. Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara convened a crisis meeting aboard the flagship Tone, anchored near Truk's main lagoon. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder in the cramped wardroom, charts and diagrams covering every available surface. Reports from scout planes and submarine reconnaissance were collated, showing that U.S. carrier task groups rarely followed predictable routes. Any attempt to preempt them required the Japanese to commit forces well beyond Truk, stretching supply lines and leaving vital positions exposed. Admiral Koga's voice cut through the tension. "We cannot wait for them to come to us," he said. "We must strike where they will appear, but we lack sufficient eyes. Our submarines report nothing, and our patrol aircraft reach only a fraction of the distances they cover." The problem, as Koga and his staff understood, was not merely operational but also technological. Japanese reconnaissance planes, particularly the Aichi E-13A Jake float planes, had a maximum range of roughly 1,200 nautical miles and were vulnerable to interception. Even when these scouts sighted U.S. carriers, the task of relaying information back to Truk and organizing an interception often resulted in delays of hours, time in which an Essex carrier could launch dozens of sorties and withdraw before Japanese forces could engage. Sato, now acting as Koga's intelligence liaison, presented detailed movement patterns observed over the last 3 cycles. The carriers maintain a spacing of 10 to 12 nautical miles between vessels, forming a screen of radar pickets and fighter cover, he explained. Our reports indicate air groups of approximately 90 aircraft per carrier, with strike missions capable of exceeding 250 sorties per day. P-38S patrol ahead of and alongside strike waves, effectively denying our Zeros the initiative. The room fell silent as the implications became clear. Unlike prior engagements where Japanese pilots could control the skies with concentrated force, the combination of U.S. industrial endurance, fighter escorts, and precise planning created an operational environment where interception was rarely feasible. Every sortie flown by Japanese aircraft risked attrition without inflicting decisive damage. Despite this, Japanese pilots continued to mount aggressive interception efforts. On December 12th, a flight of 18 Zeros under Lieutenant Akira Hayashi scrambled to intercept a reported strike group heading toward Ponape. The Japanese aircraft climbed rapidly, attempting to reach altitude before contact. Reports from U.S. pilots later noted the Zeros' approach, but the P-38s, maintaining tight formations on the carrier's flanks, immediately engaged. Dogfights erupted at altitudes exceeding 20,000 feet. Zeros, renowned for agility but fragile at high speeds and in extended maneuvers, struggled against the P-38's heavier armament and twin-engine redundancy. Several Japanese pilots were forced to disengage after sustaining engine or control surface damage. The strike group executed its bombing mission unimpeded, targeting supply depots and oil storage facilities at Ponape before returning to carriers positioned beyond the range of Japanese pursuit. The intercepted battle demonstrated the futility of traditional IJN tactics against the evolving U.S. carrier doctrine. Japanese formations, built for concentrated mass attacks, were vulnerable to long-range interception and air cover integration. Even when Zeros managed to engage P-38s or bombers, their losses were often unsustainable. Post-war interrogation reports of Japanese pilots emphasized this frustration. "We flew with courage, but the outcome was often predetermined. Their fighters never let us reach the bombers in time." At Truk headquarters, the implications were stark. Hara and Koga discussed dispersing remaining aircraft to secondary airfields to reduce vulnerability, but logistical limitations, including fuel shortages, maintenance capacity, and spare parts, restricted these options. The Japanese command faced a strategic dilemma: commit resources to confront carriers and risk catastrophic loss, or conserve forces and concede operational control of the region. The Essex-class carrier's regularity compounded the psychological strain. Every 6 weeks, Japanese forces would detect signs of approaching American task groups, triggering heightened alerts. Despite preparation, they were almost invariably late to the fight. Each cycle reinforced a sense of inevitability. The carriers struck with precision, then withdrew before effective Japanese response could be mounted. This pattern shaped Japanese tactical doctrine for the remainder of 1943, emphasizing reactive rather than proactive measures. Further complicating matters, U.S. intelligence, partially informed by signals intercepts and reconnaissance, allowed carrier commanders to adapt their routing and timing, avoiding known Japanese patrol zones. The combination of Essex-class endurance, air group flexibility, and P-38 escorts created a dynamic where Japanese forces were almost always a step behind. By the end of December, Koga summarized the operational reality in his command journal. The carriers do not merely attack, they dominate. Our attempts to flank, intercept, or predict their movement are met with superior speed, firepower, and timing. Each appearance is a reminder of our technological and operational inferiority in this domain. The P-38s are the eyes and hands of our enemy, denying initiative and shaping the battlefield. In the darkened wardroom, officers understood the broader implications. The repeated flanking failures revealed that even well-planned counterattacks could not overcome the combined advantages of U.S. industrial output, pilot training, and operational integration. For the Japanese Navy, the Central Pacific was no longer a contest of bravery or strategy alone. It had become a test of endurance against a system capable of regenerating strength faster than they could expend it. As night fell over Truk Lagoon, searchlights swept the water for enemy aircraft that would not come. Instead, the Essex carriers had vanished beyond the horizon once again, leaving Japanese commanders to reconcile with a stark reality. The 6-week cycle was a weapon in itself, shaping the war not merely through strikes, but by imposing a relentless operational tempo that Japan could neither anticipate nor match. January 1944 opened with a cold, grey dawn over Truk Lagoon. From the observation posts scattered along the coral atolls, Japanese lookouts strained to detect any hint of American movement. Yet the Essex-class carriers remained ghostly, appearing with methodical precision and disappearing just as quickly, leaving only the aftermath of their strikes in the form of disrupted supply depots and scattered wreckage of small craft. Admiral Koga paced the wardroom aboard the Chuichi, reviewing the latest intelligence reports. The Japanese command had begun to rely heavily on a patchwork of sources: intercepted radio transmissions, submarine patrols, and aerial reconnaissance. Still, every report carried uncertainty. "We are chasing shadows," Koga muttered. "We hear whispers, but the enemy always moves where we are not." Vice Admiral Chuichi Hara opened a stack of captured Allied documents, recently retrieved from a downed reconnaissance plane in the Bismarck Sea. The documents were fragmentary: carrier deck schedules, air group rotations, and maintenance logs for P-38 squadrons. Even in their incompleteness, they offered Japanese planners a chilling insight into the industrial scale behind the American carrier fleet. One memorandum indicated that Essex-class carriers could sortie up to 300 aircraft per week if rotated efficiently, a level of output that dwarfed the entire IJN carrier fleet. Hara tapped the paper with a slender finger. "They do not merely attack. Each cycle renews itself, each air group refreshed. Their carriers are not a single strike force, they are a system." He glanced at Koga. If only our reconnaissance could match this rhythm, we might stand a chance of interception. In the field, Japanese scouts worked tirelessly to track every sign of approaching forces. E-13. A floatplanes launched from remote airstrips in the Marshalls and Carolines, flying long patrols in hopes of sighting carrier task forces. Submarines reported fleeting glimpses of smoke and movement, only to lose contact as American destroyers formed anti-submarine screens. Even when sightings occurred, delays in communication often rendered them tactically obsolete. Captured Japanese debriefings from pilots involved in these reconnaissance flights reveal frustration and futility. Lieutenant Commander Masahiro Tanaka, writing post-war in 1945, described one patrol. "We spotted ships on the horizon, but the moment we transmitted our report, they were gone. It was as if the enemy knew where we would look before we even took flight. The P-38s loomed constantly, forcing us to keep altitude and distance. Every sortie was an exercise in endurance, yet we never engaged meaningfully." Back at Truk, Koga and his staff considered alternative strategies. One idea involved preemptive dispersal, stationing Zeros and reconnaissance aircraft along multiple potential flight paths, hoping to detect and intercept the American carriers. But resources were scarce. Fuel reserves could not sustain such a wide net, and maintenance crews were already stretched thin, keeping aircraft airworthy. Japanese planners also experimented with deception, attempting to mask the true locations of their positions. Dummy installations, false radio signals, and simulated fleet movements were employed in an effort to lure American aircraft into predictable paths, yet these measures had limited effect. Post-war U.S. Navy analyses noted that American carrier strike planning incorporated redundancy and reconnaissance flexibility precisely to counter such feints. The Japanese efforts were clever, but always one step behind the systemic advantage of U.S. industrial and operational depth. Intelligence briefings increasingly highlighted the role of the P-38 Lightning as more than just an escort fighter. Pilots and commanders described the aircraft as interceptors without pause, capable of denying Japanese reconnaissance any freedom of movement. Each sighting of a P-38 over the horizon was a reminder that American air superiority extended not only to attack formations, but also to the very eyes and ears of Japanese intelligence. Despite these setbacks, Japanese naval leadership remained determined. Admiral Koga authorized a series of complex coordination exercises among the scattered garrisons in the Carolines. These maneuvers involved synchronized patrols, rapid reporting chains, and attempts at long-range interception. Yet even the most meticulously rehearsed plans were hampered by logistical realities. Fuel consumption, aircraft maintenance cycles, and pilot fatigue repeatedly undermined execution. The psychological toll was mounting. Intelligence officers began recording in their logs a recurring phrase: "The enemy is everywhere, yet nowhere." Essex-class carriers, appearing on schedule every 6 weeks, had become an omnipresent spectre. Their appearance dictated Japanese defensive postures, forced constant readiness, and eroded morale. Each cycle reinforced the perception of inevitability. No matter how fast or courageous Japanese pilots were, they faced an adversary whose industrial and tactical system allowed strikes with impunity and withdrawal before retaliation could be organized. One striking incident occurred in mid-January 1944. Japanese scouts reported a carrier task force near Votche Atoll. In response, Hara dispatched a small interception group of 24 Zeros and 2 reconnaissance planes. The Americans, anticipating a probable approach vector, had already rotated P-38s and bombers to positions along the likely route. When the Japanese aircraft approached, they encountered a screen of Lightning fighters, and the strike group altered course, evading engagement entirely. Returning pilots recounted the experience as a near-perfect execution of American operational doctrine: strike, screen, and withdrawal, leaving no decisive engagement possible. By late January, the recurring cycles had established a rhythm in Japanese planning that mirrored the enemy's operational tempo. The 6-week appearance of Essex-class carriers was no longer merely an event. It had become a strategic constraint. Every move, every sortie, every patrol was now reactive, dictated by a force that Japanese intelligence could observe but never fully predict. Koga summarized the state of affairs in his wartime journal. Our adversary strikes not only with ships and aircraft, but with the relentless cadence of their production and planning. Each cycle enforces our limitations and reveals the depth of their system. To confront it directly is to court disaster. To ignore it is to invite further losses. We have glimpsed the future of naval warfare, and it is a lesson in endurance and adaptability beyond our current means. As night fell over Truk Lagoon, the sense of pervasive observation lingered. Even in the darkness, Japanese officers knew that somewhere in the vast Pacific, Essex-class carriers and their P-38 escorts were moving toward their next target. The whisper of engines over open water had become a constant in the minds of those who watched and waited, a reminder that the war in the Central Pacific had shifted from a contest of bravery to a struggle against an industrial and operational machine that could appear, strike, and vanish on a schedule that Japan could neither anticipate nor disrupt. February 1944 dawned over the Caroline Islands with an uneasy calm, a deceptive quiet that masked the constant threat of American carrier task forces. The Japanese Imperial Navy, still reeling from repeated encounters with Essex-class carriers, attempted to implement a series of adjustments aimed at mitigating the devastating impact of these 6-week strike cycles. Yet each measure, while clever on paper, revealed the growing gulf between Japanese tactical improvisation and American operational sophistication. Admiral Koga convened a strategy meeting aboard the Chuichi, flanked by Vice Admiral Hara, Rear Admiral Masatomi Kimura, and senior staff officers. Maps of the Central Pacific were spread across the wardroom table, annotated with every recorded sighting of American carriers in the past 6 months. Aircraft losses, submarine reports, and intercepted communications were all considered in evaluating potential countermeasures. Koga spoke with measured urgency. The Essex-class carriers have become a metronome for their operations. We can see the intervals, yet our strikes always arrive too late. To change this, we must either anticipate their presence or deny them freedom of maneuver. He paused, letting the weight of the statement sink in. We have neither the intelligence nor the resources for either. Hara suggested a distributed deployment of reconnaissance aircraft along potential approach vectors. If we spread our float planes from Truk to Wotje, we may detect them earlier, he proposed. Even a partial sighting could allow us to concentrate interceptors. Koga considered the recommendation. Fuel shortages loomed over every decision. Dispersal reduces detection gaps, yes, he said, but also halves our operational endurance. Many aircraft will return without ever sighting the enemy, and attrition will accumulate faster than we can replace losses. In parallel, Japanese planners experimented with timing raids to coincide with predicted arrival windows of Essex-class carriers. Using historical records, they calculated the 6-week cycles to forecast potential strike opportunities. Submarines were positioned in the Bismarck Sea and the Western Carolines to shadow the American carriers, while aircraft patrols extended as far east as the Phoenix Islands. The results were discouraging. American task forces, supported by extensive reconnaissance and rapid air group rotation, frequently altered their course and timing. Radar-equipped P-38s screened the flanks, intercepting Japanese scouts before meaningful contact could be made. Even when detection occurred, U.S. strike groups could withdraw and reposition with speed and flexibility that rendered Japanese planning obsolete. Rear Admiral Kimura observed in his post-war memoirs that one February encounter illustrated the futility of these efforts. A submarine reported the presence of an American carrier task force near Wolei Atoll. Japanese Zeros and reconnaissance aircraft were dispatched to intercept. When the pilots finally reached the coordinates, they were confronted by P-38 Lightning escorts that forced them to break off the engagement. By the time they returned, the carriers had vanished without leaving a trace. Kimura later reflected, "We fought shadows of a force that could always choose the moment and the place of engagement. Our calculations could not match their rhythm." Meanwhile, Japanese logistics suffered under the strain of repeated adjustments. Aircraft maintenance schedules became impossible to sustain. Every patrol, even those that failed to contact the enemy, consumed critical resources. Fuel shortages forced the curtailing of essential training flights, while the accelerated tempo of operations exhausted pilots, reducing combat effectiveness and increasing mechanical failures. Intelligence reports began emphasizing not only the movement of American carriers, but also the composition of their air groups. Essex-class carriers routinely deployed air groups of 90 to 100 aircraft, including F6F Hellcats, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avengers. Each carrier could generate up to 250 to 300 sorties per day, allowing overlapping strikes that maximized both coverage and lethality. In contrast, Japanese carriers were far fewer, with less efficient sortie rates, often hampered by mechanical issues and pilot inexperience. Koga and Hara convened a classified session on the potential use of kamikaze-style tactics, years before the widespread employment of such measures. The notion involved sacrificing aircraft and pilots to target American carriers directly, hoping to disrupt their operational cycles. The concept, though radical, reflected desperation rather than strategic advantage. The Japanese leadership recognized the limitations. Pilots lacked the training for effective targeting, aircraft were scarce, and the American anti-aircraft defenses were formidable. Japanese post-war interrogations revealed a shared awareness among admirals of the structural disadvantages they faced. Lieutenant General Yoshio Ikeda, interviewed in 1946, remarked, "We observed their carriers appear every 6 weeks, a cycle enforced not by luck but by the machinery of their industry and planning. Our attempts to anticipate, to outmaneuver, to strike preemptively, these were acts of courage, but ultimately inconsequential. The rhythm of Essex-class operations dictated the tempo of our war in the Central Pacific. Despite repeated failures, the Japanese continued to adapt, albeit in increasingly constrained ways. Radar arrays were relocated to high points on the islands, long-range artillery was adjusted for expected approach corridors, and night-flying patrols were intensified to reduce daytime losses. Each adjustment, however, required manpower and resources that were steadily eroding under the strain of American air raids and naval bombardments. By late February 1944, the psychological impact of the 6-week cycle was evident in the demeanor of Japanese officers and sailors. Reports describe a pervasive sense of inevitability. The carriers would appear, they would strike, and they would vanish. Even victories in minor skirmishes were fleeting, overshadowed by the knowledge that the enemy could always return on schedule, backed by the industrial might to sustain continuous operations. Koga summarized the dilemma in a memorandum to the combined fleet. Our adjustments, though inventive, confront an enemy whose operational depth and resource capacity exceed our ability to respond. Each new tactic is absorbed, countered, and rendered insufficient by the industrial and procedural power of the Americans. We are engaged not merely with their fleet, but with a system that reproduces itself with relentless efficiency. As the chapter of winter faded into early spring, the Japanese Navy faced a sobering truth. No amount of tactical ingenuity could fully compensate for the industrial and operational advantages of the United States. The 6-week cycle of Essex-class carrier appearances had become an unbroken rhythm, a relentless drumbeat that dictated Japanese strategy, tested morale, and foreshadowed the eventual unravelling of Japan's defensive posture across the Central Pacific. March 1944 arrived with a grim clarity. The Japanese Imperial Navy's attempts to adjust to the relentless American carrier cycle were failing. Intelligence reports from Truk and Chuichi detailed sightings of U.S. reconnaissance aircraft and, more ominously, the unmistakable silhouettes of Essex-class carriers slicing through the horizon. For Japanese planners, every appearance marked both a tactical opportunity and an existential threat. Admiral Koga, Vice Admiral Hara, and their senior staff gathered in the Truk headquarters to assess the latest intercept reports. A PBY Catalina had returned with photographs of two Essex-class carriers approximately 400 nautical miles east of Truk, accompanied by their destroyer screen. The intelligence indicated a full complement of 90 to 100 aircraft per carrier, ready to launch strikes within hours. Fuel and munitions stockpiles were immediately recalculated to determine how many aircraft could be launched in response. The Japanese naval doctrine emphasized decisive engagement, yet the 6-week cycle had forced the admirals to adopt reactive measures. Hara, pointing to the plotted positions on the chart, remarked, "We can try to assemble our zero groups for a preemptive strike, but their P-38 escorts will intercept long before our bombers reach the carriers. Every approach we take is visible to them." Koga, ever the pragmatist, nodded gravely. "We have only two choices: attempt interception with limited resources, risking attrition, or preserve our forces and pray our carriers are out of range. Neither choice inspires confidence." By mid-morning, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had spotted the American forces' movement towards Wolei Atoll. Zeros scrambled from Truk to intercept, a hastily organized formation of 36 aircraft led by Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Ogawa. They climbed to meet the incoming threat, hoping to disrupt the American air group before it could launch its strike. The first engagement occurred over open water. American P-38 Lightnings, operating as protective screens, engaged the Japanese formation. The encounter was swift and brutal. The P-38s, equipped with superior range and heavy armament, inflicted immediate losses. Ogawa's formation lost 6 aircraft within 10 minutes, and the remainder was forced to break off the attack. Japanese reports later described the scene with a mixture of awe and frustration. "They came at us with speed we could not match. Their guns cut through our formation as if it were paper." Meanwhile, the American carriers launched a coordinated strike. SBD Dauntless dive bombers, escorted by F6F Hellcats, targeted Japanese installations and supply depots on Wolei. The attack achieved both tactical and psychological effect. Explosions shattered warehouses, destroyed fuel lines, and scattered the island's defensive forces. Though casualties among Japanese personnel were moderate, the destruction of infrastructure further limited the ability to project air power in the Central Pacific. Admiral Koga, observing from the command center, noted the patterns emerging in each 6-week cycle. The Essex-class carriers did not merely appear. They executed methodical strikes designed to exploit weaknesses, with precise timing and overwhelming force. Each American task force demonstrated a coordination of reconnaissance, fighter cover, and strike planning that Japanese radar and scouting networks struggled to match. The day's engagements also highlighted the limitations of Japanese intelligence. Despite years of carrier tracking and patrols, reports were consistently outdated by the time decisions were made. Submarine sightings, while valuable, often arrived too late or were contradicted by rapid American course changes. Even high-altitude observation aircraft were vulnerable to interception, leaving Koga and Hara to rely on fragments of information to guide their tactical choices. Post-engagement analyses, preserved in debriefing reports of the 13th Fighter Command, reveal the toll these encounters took on Japanese morale. Pilots expressed frustration at the seeming inevitability of American dominance in the air and at the inability of ground commanders to provide timely intelligence. Rear Admiral Kimura would later recount, "We felt as though we were always reacting to shadows, our movements anticipated before we executed them." The cycle had become a form of psychological warfare, imposing a rhythm we could neither break nor escape. Loss statistics from this March engagement were telling. Japanese aircraft lost totaled 14 Zeros, while American losses were minimal, just 2 Hellcats, both from minor mechanical failure rather than enemy action. The disparity underscored the growing operational advantage of US forces, not only in numbers but in technology, training, and procedural efficiency. Despite the setbacks, Japanese commanders persisted. Koga ordered follow-up reconnaissance flights, hoping to locate the American carrier's return route. Hara reorganized remaining air units, emphasizing high-speed interception and staggered patrols to maintain continuous coverage. Yet even as these measures were enacted, American carriers completed their strikes, refueled, and withdrew in a manner that reinforced the predictability of the 6-week cycle. In post-war interrogations, several Japanese officers reflected on this period with a sense of inevitability. Lieutenant Colonel Masayuki Tanaka noted, "Every 6 weeks we faced them as if rehearsing for a performance we could never control. We adjusted, we calculated, we scrambled, yet the result was always the same. The Essex carriers appeared, struck, and vanished, leaving us to wonder what our next response could possibly achieve." By nightfall, the engagements over Wolei had concluded. The American carriers were gone, their presence etched into the minds of Japanese officers as both a tactical and psychological benchmark. Damage assessments, pilot debriefings, and strategic analyses consumed the rest of the evening. Japanese planners understood that even minor engagements carried consequences far beyond the immediate losses. Every failure weakened the perception of invincibility, eroded pilot morale, and strained an already overstretched logistics system. Koga convened a final assessment before retiring for the night. "We have learned," he said quietly, "that the cycle is not merely a pattern, but a law imposed by the enemy's industry, training, and planning. We may adjust, we may resist, but we cannot force them to follow our expectations." The rhythm of Essex-class carriers dictates the pace of this war. As the moon rose over Truk Lagoon, the Japanese command staff could only wait for the next 6-week cycle, aware that the next appearance of the Essex-class carriers would test every tactic, every pilot, and every ounce of resolve. The Central Pacific had become a stage where industrial might and operational foresight defined victory, and where Japanese ingenuity, though formidable, was increasingly insufficient against an enemy whose rhythm was unstoppable. April 1944 dawned over Truk Lagoon with the muted light of an early tropical morning. For Japanese commanders, each day carried a weight far heavier than the physical demands of war. Intelligence briefings were no longer mere updates, they were warnings, an unending cycle of calculations that measured not just enemy strength, but the limits of their own endurance. Admiral Koga convened his staff at 0700 hours in the reinforced planning room. Vice Admiral Hara and Rear Admiral Kimura joined him, alongside senior intelligence officers. The table was covered with charts showing the last 4 Essex-class carrier appearances, plotted meticulously with aircraft sorties, observed routes, and estimated payloads. The data painted a clear yet terrifying pattern. The Americans maintained not only numerical superiority, but operational consistency. Every 6 weeks the same carriers appeared, launching coordinated strikes that left Japanese defences scrambling. Koga studied the charts carefully. "We cannot continue to fight blindly," he said. "We must anticipate their timing, their targets, and their escorts. If we fail, it is not only men who die, it is the morale of every unit under our command." Hara nodded, pointing to a series of plotted courses showing potential interception zones. "Our Zeros are fast, but their P-38s can engage before we reach the carriers. Their range is greater, their coordination more precise. We must consider ambushes, layered defences, and decoy formations." The Japanese staff had begun to implement incremental adjustments. Long-range reconnaissance seaplanes were dispatched earlier, flight paths staggered to maintain continuous coverage, and small picket forces were stationed on outlying atolls to detect approaching enemy carriers. Even so, the reality remained grim. The Essex-class carriers moved with an efficiency and protection that Japanese radar and scouting methods could rarely overcome. By mid-morning, the first reports of American activity began to arrive. An American patrol plane had been sighted northeast of Truk, signaling the approach of a carrier task force. Japanese anti-aircraft crews scrambled, while Zeros were prepared for launch. Lieutenant Commander Hiroshi Ogawa, back in the cockpit of his familiar A6M0, knew the drill. Intercept the carriers, disrupt their strikes, and survive. The first air skirmish unfolded over open water, echoing the events of the previous month. P-38 Lightnings intercepted Japanese formations at a distance, forcing evasive maneuvers before the Zeros could close in. Dogfights erupted at high altitude, each side maneuvering aggressively, the roar of engines punctuated by bursts of gunfire. Japanese pilots described the P-38s as fast shadows that struck without warning, a testament to the limitations imposed by the Americans' superior aircraft design. Meanwhile, American dive bombers targeted Japanese installations on nearby atolls, achieving significant destruction. Fuel depots, airfields, and storage warehouses were hit with precision, further constraining Japan's already limited operational flexibility. Reports noted that sortie rates for the Americans remained consistent, between 250 and 300 sorties per carrier per day, underscoring the industrial advantage that supported this relentless operational tempo. The psychological effect on Japanese officers and pilots was profound. Post-war testimonies describe a pervasive sense of inevitability. Lieutenant Colonel Masayuki Tanaka reflected in 1945. "We trained, we planned, we flew into the air with determination, yet every cycle ended the same. Our efforts were fragments against a wave we could not contain." Koga and Hara understood the stakes. The Essex-class carriers were not merely military assets, they represented a new standard of warfare. Their presence dictated tempo, logistics, and strategy. The Japanese command could attempt to resist, but every loss eroded both capacity and morale. Every 6-week cycle reinforced a lesson painfully clear. The war was increasingly being fought on American terms. The day ended with the carriers withdrawing beyond sight, leaving a trail of destruction and a sense of muted despair. Japanese pilots returned to Truk, their aircraft damaged or low on fuel. Engineers worked through the night, patching planes and recalibrating anti-aircraft defences. Koga met with Hara one final time in the dim light of the planning room. "Our forces are stretched to the limit," Koga said quietly. "Every 6 weeks we face them as if rehearsing for a performance we cannot control. Yet we must endure. For without endurance there is no hope of victory.